So, for those of us who aren't as well read on the subject of Jefferson, what would you say is your main thesis of his presidency, and what would you say is the most, defining characteristic of it?
Oh, well, the chief principle that he was concerned about was, again, this idea that there should not be too much authority in the central government.
Join the best in the movement. It's Conservative Conversations with ISI, educating for liberty since 1953.
Welcome back. You're listening to Conservative Conversations with Marlo Slayback and Tom Saroof.
Joining us on the podcast today is Kevin Gutzman, who is professor of history at Western Connecticut State University. In addition to his scholarly articles, he has written a number of scholarly books, including Virginia's American Revolution, From Dominion to Republic, 1776 to 1840. His works for a popular audience include The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Constitution, which was named one of the top 10 conservative books of 2007, and Who Killed the Constitution? And his newest book is The Jeffersonians, The Visionary Presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Welcome to the podcast, Dr. Gutzman.
Happy to be here.
Before we begin with our interview, we'd like to thank you for listening to Conservative Conversations. This podcast is a production of the Intercollegiate Studies Institute, and our mission is to educate for liberty. If you'd like to help us in fulfilling this mission, please rate and review this podcast on Apple Podcasts to help us reach more listeners like yourself. So, Kevin, there's a lot to talk about in terms of the early republic, and many of our listeners and conservatives generally are interested in this period of American history and look to the founding era with great interest. So looking forward to kind of getting into a lot of these ideas and everything you've written about. But perhaps we could start first with a methodological question, which is, how do you actually approach this period, and how does that shape how you look at the founding, and generally how does that shape your views on the American character and the identity?
I guess I could answer that in 10 words or fewer. The idea of writing this book came to me accidentally. I had Daniel Walker Howe, the Pulitzer Prize-winning historian, blurb my previous book on James Madison, and although he liked the book, he said he wished I had devoted more attention to his presidency. But of course, the subject of my book was Madison as constitutionalist, so his presidency, which I consider kind of a low point of his career, was not obviously going to get a lot of attention. However, I started thinking about that after I finished my immediate preceding book, which was about Jefferson's political program, and it seemed to me that you couldn't really write a book about Madison's presidency without discussing Jefferson's presidency, since Madison had been Secretary of State under Jefferson. He was his chief lieutenant, main collaborator, and then, of course, Madison's presidency naturally and seamlessly bled over into Monroe's. It happens that although there's always been attention both from the book-buying public and from scholars to Jefferson, and although there's been a kind of recrudescence of interest in Madison since the late 1980s, there is no other book on this subject of the Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe administrations. The only time in American history we've had 3 consecutive 2-term presidents of the same party. So my book starts with a discussion of Jefferson's first inaugural address, which I think, if we're being generous, we would say is one of 3 or 4 inaugural addresses in American history that are actually worth reading. And, of course, Jefferson and his auditors didn't know in 1801 that what he was laying out was not just the program of his first term as president, but what the 3 of them and their collaborators in Congress were going to try to do over the following quarter century. They essentially implemented everything Jefferson said in his first inaugural address. Some of it was a spectacular success. Some of it was a gigantic debacle, and that's what the book's about. So when it comes to the question of American identity, that's an interesting one. Jefferson thought that the election of 1800, culminating in his victory in the House over his running mate Aaron Burr, had shown that people in general understood the American Revolution the way he did. And so he, of course, never one to scant his own reputation. He thought this meant essentially that the revolution had been dedicated to the idea that there would be an American Union, that the federal system would be highly decentralized, that people would be making most of the important governmental decisions through having local elections, and that the United States would be kind of experiment that people in other countries could observe, and having seen its success, and he was entirely confident that it would be successful, they could emulate what the Americans were doing. So at least for the first quarter of the 19th century, Jefferson thought that American identity was tied up in his own political ideology. And the voters across the country seemed to ratify this idea. By the time the period ended, the opposition Federalist Party no longer existed.
I'm curious as well because Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe, not only of the same political party, the Democratic Republican Party, but also they all come from the same state of Virginia. And so I guess it was last week or 2 weeks ago, we were at the American Politics and Government Summit, which was ISI's inaugural faculty summit. And one of the panelists mentioned this discussion of like Virginia supremacy. So I'd love to get your, I'd love to ask about that. If not only the political ideology, but also the regional differences in the early republic are far more accentuated at that time than they are today. So I'm wondering how these three men would have been shaped by the state that they came from, and how that would translate into the national political program that the three of them espoused.
Well, it wasn't only that the three of them were from the same state, but Jefferson and Madison were from neighboring counties, and Monroe, before the current central grounds of the University of Virginia, which you can see from Jefferson's back door, became the grounds of the University of Virginia. They had been James Monroe's farm. So, in other words, the two of them were as close to being next-door neighbors as they could be. Actually, Monroe later in life moved to an estate that was literally next door to Jefferson's house. So, what was it about them? Well, yes, it's true that there was substantially more differentiation among the states and more identification of people with their states then than there is now. One story one sees in the book is New England sectionalism rearing its head over and over again. We tend to look back on the past, and if we study political history and think, well, particular subject matter, particular programs had their appeal at particular times, and we take up bygone political causes or initiatives on their own merits. But often what was really going on was that people from particular parts of the country were trying to manipulate the political system to springboard their own part of the country up into the elite position that the Virginians had managed to grab. So I think one way of understanding a lot of the dissent that went on in New England is by thinking of it as manifestation of New England sectionalism, that people in New England saw the Virginians as being radically different from themselves, which in many senses they were, and resented it. I actually once encountered when I was doing some research at what's now called the Virginia Museum of History and Culture in Richmond, I found a newspaper editorial from what was then called the Connecticut Current from 1806. And the editor of the Connecticut Current was addressing Connecticut Republicans, that is Jeffersonians in Connecticut. And what he said was, hey, you Jeffersonians in Connecticut, isn't there any of you who has any merit? Must it be that all the top positions in the federal government, if they're going to be held by Republicans, are held by people from Virginia? What is the matter with you? And so, of course, there's a bit of a dig at the bedraggled minority within Connecticut. But on the other hand, there's also a bit of truth in that. It was kind of offensive. Actually, by the time you get to the Monroe administration, Monroe, I think, intentionally did not choose somebody to be his successor who was from Virginia. He did not put a Virginian in an important cabinet position. There was not an obvious Virginian candidate. And as I say, I think that Monroe had in mind that 3 consecutive Virginia presidents were enough. And of course, people from New England agreed with him about that.
So George Washington was also from Virginia, but it seems like he had quite different views politically, from the Democratic Republicans, and supported things like the First Bank, And while he wasn't a member of any political party, he'd probably be closer to the Federalists. So what are your thoughts on how the Jeffersonians stack up against Washington despite that similarity in their home state?
Oh, well, I think it's not entirely clear what Washington's political views were. So if one reads the memoranda that he had his cabinet officers write for him about the constitutionality of the bank bill, one finds at the end of Secretary Jefferson's memo to Washington a statement that if Washington didn't find Jefferson's argument for the unconstitutionality of the bank bill persuasive, if he thought it was a close question, Jefferson advised, then Washington should go ahead and sign the bill because clearly the Congress thought it was constitutional. And Washington actually later wrote a letter to a friend in which he said that he had several times as president signed into law bills that he thought were undesirable. So he apparently thought that the president's role, his exercise of the veto power, was not supposed to be a matter of imposing his own views on the Congress. It was merely a mechanism he could use to police the constitutional boundaries of Congress's behavior. And as I say, we don't really know whether he finally decided that the bank bill was constitutional, as Secretary Hamilton advised, or having decided that it was a close question, that he went along with Jefferson and thought he should therefore defer to Congress. People who were prominent Republicans did admire George Washington. So even to the end of his days, James Madison had prints and busts and other images of Washington around his house. And this was not unusual. People thought, and it was kind of a bipartisan position, people thought that Washington's peculiar political personality had been essential not only to winning the revolution, but then to establishing a federal republic in the country. And although Washington went to his grave very unhappy with Madison and Jefferson, apparently that was not reciprocated.
I'm wondering, and you mentioned this sort of earlier about how the election of 1800 confirms in the mind of Jefferson that his view of the revolution is being vindicated.
Yes.
And so I'm wondering if you could talk about the differences between Thomas Jefferson and John Adams, and you can delve a bit more into that as sort of laying the groundwork for what would become the Jefferson presidency.
Well, Jefferson's idea was essentially all the way back to 1774 when he became famous across the continent as the author of a pamphlet that friends of his who published it had entitled Some Review of the Rights of British America. Jefferson thought that the revolution was about the idea that if people in Virginia were going to be taxed, it should be by officials in Virginia, right? So this was not looking to the idea of having an American superstate that would govern all the states from some central location. And he remained devoted to this idea. Even when he was president, he still had the same idea that, in general, as he once put it, if it came to a contest between the federal government and the states, of course, he would prefer the states. But then within a state, he would prefer counties. And within the counties, he would prefer wards. So his idea was that the average person could not be, as he had been, president, vice president, secretary of state, governor. But actually, I think he's the only person in American history who held all those jobs. But the average person could help to shape policies that were made at the local level. So the ideal would be to have as many decisions about what went on in some small town in Ohio made by people in that small town in Ohio as was practicable. And he did not change his mind about that when he came into high positions, right? So this was really a theme of Jefferson's statesmanship and of his political science. And it doesn't seem that Alexander Hamilton thought that idea had any merit at all. That the position Washington held, he once referred, Washington did kind of sneeringly to these petty pretenders to sovereignty, right? The states, he didn't think they deserved any respect. And of course, this was, I'm exaggerating slightly, but this was a result of the fact that Washington and Hamilton had been in the Army, and they had seen that Congress had not provided adequate supplies or adequate manpower to the Army. And so the first thing that forming a new government ought to ensure was that the United States could defend themselves. I'm not sure I answered your question.
Well, I asked about Adams, and you sort of
Adams,
on,
right?
On Hamilton, so they're both of the same party. But
well, they're in the same party, but Adams never really made clear what his position on the federalism question was. So there was an interesting exchange of letters between President Jefferson and former First Lady Adams about the question of the constitutionality of the Sedition Act. And Mrs. Adams thought essentially, well, Congress passed this law into law. It should have been enforced. And Jefferson told her that this had about as much validity as if Congress had ordered the American people to bow down to a golden calf, right? This was ultra vires. It was beyond what Congress had authority to do, and therefore it didn't deserve any respect at all. And Adams, I think, didn't really develop a well-articulated position on the federalism question.
So, for those of us who aren't as well read on the subject of Jefferson, what would you say is your main thesis of his presidency, and what would you say is the most, I guess, defining characteristic of it?
Oh, well, the chief principle that he was concerned about was, again, this idea that there should not be too much authority in the central government. And he thought that, and partly on the basis of the fact that, contrary to his oath in the Philadelphia Convention, James Madison had shared his records of debates in the Philadelphia Convention with Jefferson and shown him that speech on June 18th, 1787, in which Hamilton stood up all day and described the kind of monarchy he would like. Jefferson's idea of the way that the government ought to be structured was completely contrary to that. And so a lot of what he said in his first inaugural address was in answer not only to the practice of the Federalists in power the previous 12 years, but that speech of Hamilton, which was not known to the public at the time. So he laid out an ideal vision of the new federal government. He said essentially that the now, he thought perhaps permanent Republican majority would respect the states and all their rights. And he had, of course, a very broad idea of what the states' rights were. And it also, though, thought that the federal government was essential insofar as the few powers that Jeffersonians conceded it had were concerned. And there were several other principles that Jefferson noted that he and his majority in Congress were devoted to, that they were going to implement. So, for example, most obviously, maybe most famously, besides the Sedition Act, during the Adams administration, Congress and the executive had taken substantial steps to build up the military. They had bought warships, they had purchased munitions and armaments, and the Jeffersonians thought, well, this is just a waste of money, and it's establishing a kind of threat as far as the federal government's role in the economy was concerned, which they thought harkened back to the example of Walpole at the beginning of the 18th century, establishing himself as Chancellor of the Exchequer as Prime Minister. So having the central government be tied to wealthy and connected people in every state, Jefferson thought, was entirely undesirable. It had to lead to a kind of government that was common in Europe, but that Americans didn't want. So this was the chief distinguishing characteristic of the Jeffersonian program, that while it's come to be our expectation nowadays that people who are major party candidates for president will lay out a lot of promises about what they're going to do en route to being elected, the Jeffersonian position was that they were going to describe a lot of things that the federal government was going to cease doing and never to do again, they hoped, they expected. So that's really what Jefferson undertook to do in his first inaugural address.
Well, I wonder, almost as a counterpoint to that, was, I guess, maybe he was, I think, definitely skeptical of the constitutionality of doing this, but I would bring up the Louisiana Purchase.
Right.
which that was not a campaign promise, I don't think, at least.
No.
Because it's sort of the opportunity fell into his lap, and I think even though he was, I guess, skeptical about a broad and judicious interpretation of constitutional power, he even still went forward with the Louisiana Purchase. And I'm wondering, from your read of that situation, if it's sort of a question of political prudence or of the limits of political philosophy or his ideology heavily in favor of states' rights, or how these sorts of ideas and principles get played out into reality as we see historically speaking.
Well, what happened here was that Jefferson, of course, had appointed a minister to France, and that minister, Livingston from New York, the most prominent Republican in New York, had a meeting with, now, actually, I should back up a minute. So Jefferson had written privately before becoming president, there is one spot on the map, the possessor of which must be an enemy of the United States, and that is New Orleans. So the idea that the United States could purchase New Orleans or somehow obtain New Orleans was one that was kind of floating around in Republican circles. But anyway, Livingston was in France, and he had the idea that he had been given the assignment, actually, to try to negotiate a purchase of New Orleans. And when he brought this question up with the French foreign minister, Talleyrand, one of the most interesting people probably in the history of the world, supposedly he broached this notion to Talleyrand, and Talleyrand looked at him and then smiled and said, suppose I sell you all of Louisiana. And in those days, remember, Louisiana didn't include just the state of Louisiana. It actually went all the way up into Canada. So it was essentially everything between the Rockies and the Mississippi. And it included, of course, the port of New Orleans. And you can kind of imagine, I think, Livingston trying not to swallow his tongue or, smile too broadly or give away his response so that Talleyrand could see, wow, maybe I could charge this guy more than I intended to do. But anyway, the end of this conversation was that Talleyrand and Livingston had agreed to this, even though Livingston had not been given authority to buy anything other than New Orleans, and he had not been given authority to spend as much money as he ended up agreeing to spend. The day that this was happening, a second minister plenipotentiary, James Monroe, was arriving in France with the mission of hurrying this idea along, but it happens Livingston made this agreement with Talleyrand before Monroe even arrived. So that actually comes up later in my book when Monroe, presidential candidate Monroe, wants to take credit for the Louisiana Purchase. But anyway, so what ended up happening, I'm trying to make this brief, what ended up happening was Livingston made this agreement. He sent word of it back to America via the Secretary of State. Madison was giddy, right? He had no idea of this. Who could even imagine, really? They're selling them a territory larger than any European state except for Russia, right? And so Madison thinks it's a great idea. He forwards it to Jefferson, and apparently the only significant Republican who thought there was any problem with this idea was Jefferson. And Jefferson's problem with it was, he said, I can't see authority in the Constitution to do this. And Madison's response was, well, Article 2 of the Constitution says that you, as president, can enter into treaties with the advice and consent of the Senate. And he said it doesn't specify what kinds of treaties, so we have to take that to include the common kinds of treaties, which include treaties of peace, treaties of alliance, commercial treaties, and then they were common, although now they're virtually unknown. In the 18th century and early 19th century, it was common in Europe for little states in Germany to buy and sell little amounts of territory. And so Madison thought this was not even an issue. Clearly, the Treaties Clause of Article 2 covered this. And I cannot identify a single prominent Republican who did not agree with this except for Jefferson. So even the real sticklers in the Jeffersonian coalition, like John Randolph and John Taylor, people who in some sense end up being more Jeffersonian than Jefferson over time, they all thought this was fine. Jefferson, however, was not persuaded. So he asked Secretary Madison to write a draft amendment empowering the president and the federal government to do this, and so Madison drafted one, Jefferson wrote one. Jefferson corresponded with some other prominent Republicans about this, but while this is going on, Livingston over in France sends a letter to Secretary Madison saying, I've heard that Napoleon has changed his mind, right? So if you don't hurry up and agree to this, they're just going to rescind the offer. You have to agree to this immediately. And Madison kind of gigged Jefferson into, we have to hurry up and do this immediately. So Jefferson's answer was, well, I guess sometimes if you're the chief executive, you just have to do things that are fleeting opportunities and hope the people forgive you. So Jefferson never was persuaded, I think, that this had been constitutional exactly, but he thought, as in wartime, occasionally there's going to be some kind of an emergency and the executive will just have to answer, and if people don't like it, they can vote him out. They can vote his party out. And, of course, what ended up happening in reaction to the Louisiana Purchase was that the Jeffersonians became invincible in politics. This made them popular. They already had won the election in 1801, but barely. And now there was, we're just counting down the minutes until the Federalist Party folds up its tents.
So the Louisiana Purchase was a really important first step towards westward expansion.
Yes.
Could you talk about, I guess at the time, Manifest Destiny and the frontier spirit, and how whether the idea of Manifest Destiny was part of the American consciousness, or at least that of some of its political leaders at the time?
Well, of course, the term Manifest Destiny comes from later, but people like Jefferson certainly thought that the United States should be at least a continental country. In fact, Jefferson once wrote that if you had a properly federal system, that is decentralized Republican, capital R, Republican kind of a political system, why not have the United States extend from the North Pole to Tierra del Fuego? There's no reason why not, he thought. He was just giddy about this idea. So that the United States would continue to obtain land in North America was not surprising. And while, or I should say during the period my book covers, we have the Louisiana Purchase, we have the United States obtaining what were then the Spanish colonies of East Florida and West Florida, which included today's state of Florida and then the coastal areas of Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana east of the Mississippi River, huge area. And then ultimately during the Monroe administration, Secretary of State Adams signs what's called the Transcontinental Treaty, by which Spain agreed the United States extended all the way to Oregon. So nobody thought this was surprising. The Jeffersonians hoped and expected this would happen, but Federalists, although they couldn't really make a good argument against it, were unhappy with it because they thought that what it meant not only was that the Republican Party was going to be invincible, but also that New England, which was peculiar in social organization and economic organization within the United States, it was a minority section, New England was going to be swamped in this gigantic sea of Jeffersonian polities that these new states would be. They thought that America would be, and this is what Jefferson hoped it would be, a land of smallholders extending all the way to the Pacific. And so it was providential. It was just amazing to people at the time. And most of the other instances in which the United States obtained land from Spain or the British or the French or whomever were equally as fortuitous as what I've just described the Louisiana Purchase being. It wasn't a result of any particular brilliance on behalf of Jeffersonian diplomats or something. It was just, well, here it is. So now we'll buy this, now we'll buy that, now we'll take this a little bit. Why not?
I'd love to turn to James Madison, because he's a pretty complicated historical figure. Because on the one hand, he writes Federalist Papers with Hamilton and John Jay, and considered father of the Constitution. Thanks to him, all of the notes he took during the convention, we have a very good sense of what happened in Philadelphia. But at the same time, he ends up being a Democratic Republican, much closer to Jefferson on questions of the first bank and the federal assumption of state debts, for instance, Hamilton's plan for the first report on the public credit. So I'm wondering how you see Madison as a political figure. You also mentioned earlier that you thought his presidency was a low point in his public career, which seems striking to me. I think being the president is a high point in anyone's career, but love to hear more what your general impressions are of Madison as a political and historical figure.
Well, before I say something about him in general, the presidency of James Madison, the emblematic image is of a foreign army marching into Washington, burning down the Capitol and the White House, burning all the major government buildings, and the president is fleeing minutes before they arrive, and ends up spending several days kind of riding on a horse around the Capitol, trying to figure out where his wife is and communicate with fugitive cabinet members. I don't know how it's possible to say this wasn't the low point of not only of his career, but maybe American military history. I don't know. It was just a debacle. And it was a debacle that was, it followed naturally from the Republican position, not only that they wanted to make substantial cuts to the military, which you could say, well, okay, in the abstract, maybe that could be a good idea. But then they declared war without preparing for it. And against whom did they declare war? Not some small band of Indians in Indiana, against the British Empire, which had easily the mightiest navy in the world and just an army that had been fighting with Napoleon for years. And the whole thing was, it was so poorly thought out. And that gets us back to the general question of Madison's political personality and his career. In general, he had a reputation. One of his fellow delegates in Philadelphia kind of jotted down character sketches of delegates in the Philadelphia Convention. And what he said about Madison was that he was always the best prepared man in the room. Well, yes, that was true, except when it came to the war. So the war is the low point not only in Madison's career, but in this period, in the Jeffersonian era. It's hard for me to conjure what could have been worse. The United States came out of it fortuitously with substantial benefit having accrued to it. And this, I think, is part of the reason why Winston Churchill famously said, God smiles on the United States. God favors them somehow. So Madison was a brilliant political scientist. Jefferson thought that, he said that in his cabinet in those 8 years, there had never been a substantial argument. People might disagree, but nobody got angry. They would just talk major questions through, especially Jefferson, Madison, and Albert Gallatin, the Treasury Secretary, seemed to have been the brains behind this operation. And Madison was the kind of fellow who was well suited to that role. He was not an overly assertive personality. He was always prepared. He knew virtually every significant political science work in the Western canon, front to back. And not only that, but he agreed with Jefferson about every significant political question at the time. So if Jefferson said, we didn't have any substantial arguments, well, he's the one who chose the cabinet members, so that's not entirely surprising. In those days, cabinet members were actually advisors. One doubts that President Biden has ever met with all of his cabinet members at the same time, right? Nowadays, it's just kind of a title. But in those days, the cabinet really was a kind of board of advisors for the president, and Madison was well suited to this. This was the kind of position that he was cut out for, I think, to be the fellow who was informed, who could give good advice, but didn't have to be the one making the final decisions.
So turning from Madison to Monroe, because we're running out of time, so that features the decline of the Federalist Party and the era of good feelings. So beginning of the American response to European encroachments in South America with the Monroe Doctrine. What would you say about that period? And again, with the Monroe Doctrine, is there a beginning of American exceptionalism during his presidency, during Monroe's presidency?
Well, I don't think he saw the place of America in the world any differently from the way that Jefferson and Madison understood it. They thought America was an emblem of republicanism and that other people over time, other countries over time would want to emulate what the Americans had done. So if that's what we mean by American exceptionalism, all of these people agreed about that idea. I think the most notable conclusion I came to in researching this book was that by far the Monroe administration was the most successful of the three. That is, there were substantial foreign policy successes. Virtually everything in the Republicans' domestic program was implemented, and it made these people wildly popular. One reason why Monroe's administration was such a success was that he, like Jefferson, chose cabinet members well. So where there had been Madison and Gallatin in the Jefferson administration as Jefferson's chief advisors in the State Department and the Treasury Department, in the Monroe administration, the chief advisors were Calhoun at War and John Quincy Adams at State. And the two of them, of course, were brilliant. They established, they had achievements that still affect us now, not only the Transcontinental Treaty I mentioned before, but Calhoun was responsible for the fact that there actually came to be a War Department. It was kind of a title. When he took the office, it was him and a handful of clerks. But what it became was a department with an actual general staff, people who made plans, a regular process for promoting people through the ranks, all of which would have been helpful if they had been instituted before the War of 1812. And actually, the most recent biographer of Calhoun says, when the Civil War came, fortunately for the United States, the Confederacy had Calhoun's ideas, but the Union had his army. And that, I think, is true. So not only did he create the War Department, he also, within the War Department, created the Bureau of Indian Affairs, which, like the General Staff, we still have today. Quincy Adams and Calhoun had a very interesting relationship. Early on, you may not be familiar with this, but Adams kept an extremely extensive diary. For decades and decades, he wrote every day in his diary, and he held myriad top offices in the government, in Europe, in the United States, and so that's the place to start if you want to know about this period, I think. And it's interesting in Adams' diary how he describes his interaction with Calhoun in the cabinet. After they've met a few times in the cabinet, Adams wrote descriptions of his fellow cabinet members, and he said, Calhoun is easily the most intelligent, he's the best informed, he always reasons to the right conclusions. But later on in the administration, the two of them apparently were walking home from a cabinet meeting, and they got to talking about the future of slavery in the United States. And Calhoun said, well, in South Carolina, because of the climate, there are kinds of work that white men just won't do. So this is essential. And the way that our society is organized, we cannot concede the idea that slavery will continue to exist in South Carolina. And Adams says that he responded to Calhoun, well, if we had some kind of a disagreement and your state decided to leave the Union, do you think we would just let that happen? Do you think that would just go by? And at the end of this description of this conversation, Adams says that he's appalled by the fact that he thinks this is a general understanding of the institution of slavery in the South. He thinks Calhoun just sounds like another Southerner in this regard. And from that point, he says something like, it would be a good career just to oppose the existence of slavery. That would be a nice legacy to leave. And so you can see that Adams is kind of sketching out in his mind what he's going to do for the rest of his life, which we know, of course, he died on the House floor where he had just given a speech about slavery. So this dynamic within the Monroe administration is very interesting. Calhoun gave advice to Monroe about ending the Missouri controversy, which is the main domestic crisis of the Monroe administration. When bills were working their way through Congress about this, people in the South, especially Virginia, people in the South were very unhappy with what looked like the probable conclusion of the Missouri crisis. And in fact, President Monroe got a letter from his chief advisor, his son-in-law, a lawyer named George Hay in Richmond, who said, people in the General Assembly are talking about not nominating you for president again if you agree to what Congress is talking about. When they had cabinet discussions of this, Calhoun ended up telling Monroe, the most important thing about the Missouri controversy is to get it over with. So Calhoun counseled him to sign the bills that would end the Missouri controversy. When John Randolph of Roanoke, who's one of the most interesting people in this period, I have one of the most difficult parts of writing the book was deciding which Randolph stories to leave out. Anyway, when Randolph heard about the fact that the president had decided to sign off on the Missouri Compromise, his conclusion was, well, that's it. That means slavery is going to cease to exist. Eventually, there will be all these senators from these new states out there were barring slavery from anything north of Missouri's southern boundary, and ultimately that'll mean they can adopt a constitutional amendment about this question. And actually, that gets to the fact that Randolph's thinking about slavery is very interesting too, but I realize I've wandered from your question at this point. So,
well, we are coming to the end of our time, but we'd love to have you help us put a bow on the interview and the episode by telling us what would you say is the legacy of these three men, and or what should it be for? I would ask in terms of our current political moment. And I'll let you interpret that however you'd like.
Oh, boy. Well, there are a lot of very important legacies of this period of the history of the American government. One I've mentioned before is the just gigantic expansion of the United States, acquisition of territory all the way down to the southern tip of Florida and then all the way to the Pacific. That has to be one of the first things we consider. Then, of course, well, I say of course, then during the Jefferson administration, the cabinet agreed and the Congress adopted a plan for ultimately paying off the federal debt. So you probably heard people, especially libertarians, say, well, they like Andrew Jackson. There are a lot of things to object to about Andrew Jackson, but he paid off the debt, which is true, except we need to note that he paid off the debt on exactly the date that the program adopted during the Jefferson administration had contemplated finally retiring the last of the debt. So that's another thing that the Jeffersonians are responsible for. We had a moment in 1835 when the federal government had exactly zero debt. There also are, the book is not only an examination of the presidencies, it's an examination of this period in the federal government. So I have considerable discussion of what's going on in the Supreme Court at this time. I've mentioned a couple of times the Transcontinental Treaty that Secretary Adams agreed to with his Spanish opposite number during the Monroe administration. But one of the most interesting coincidences in the whole period is the day that Secretary Adams signed the Transcontinental Treaty, he went back to his boarding house. That is, members of Congress used to stay in boarding houses, and some of the cabinet secretaries stayed in boarding houses. So he went back to his boarding house after agreeing to the Transcontinental Treaty with the Spanish minister, and the other people who lived in his boarding house had spent the day at the Supreme Court where they were arguing the case of McCulloch versus Maryland. So what day in American history was more important than that? Anyway, one kind of leitmotif of the book is that there are very significant constitutional precedents being laid down by the Supreme Court, which at that time was headed by Jefferson's cousin, John Marshall, and Jeffersonians disapproved of them for various reasons. So we have over and over in the book Jefferson complaining about the latest product of the Marshall Court and about the huge flaw in the Constitution that it doesn't give the people any way immediately to correct errors by the court. And he's corresponding with the Chief Justice of what's now the Virginia Supreme Court about his disagreements with these developments. And he's corresponding, Jefferson is, with one of the people he appointed to the court. And how come you don't ever dissent, right? Why are all the opinions unanimous? So anyway, I think this is a very important part of the story too. There are other things that are germane to contemporary discussions in American politics. One is Monroe, like Madison and Jefferson before him, hoped that American Indians could be folded into American society. So they all agreed, they thought, that it would be better for the American Indians if they became sedentary farmers like Euro-Americans. And they made substantial effort to make this happen. So I show at various points in the book what they were doing along these lines. President Monroe, for example, supported establishment of schools to teach young Indian kids English and various other kind of efforts like that. I can't really capture everything that I think is significant about the period in a short space, but Obviously, the dispute about the way to read the Constitution is ongoing. In general, nowadays, Republicans tend to be Jeffersonian in this connection. Some of them even say we're Jefferson, or they say they're Madisonian, which is the same thing. And on the other hand, Democrats tend to take the Hamiltonian or John Marshall's position, very, very broad as we can make it, reading of the powers of the federal government. And you may have inferred by now that I tend to agree with the Jeffersonian arguments in this connection. But I try in the book to be fair to both sides so that the reader who's not acquainted with these disputes will understand what they were about. Partly they were about personality, but mostly they were about the future. And of course, Jefferson thought what's going on here is the Republicans are winning all the political battles. In fact, their opposition ceases to exist, which is a unique development in American history. Meantime, Hamiltonianism is being written permanently into constitutional law. So we have these principles of centralization that the New Dealers and the Great Society and, Joe Biden can pick up later and point to and say, well, this is our long-standing understanding. But this was a tiny minority's position at the time. It just happened that minority was ensconced in the Supreme Court. So there's that. One other thing that, of course, is kind of a hot issue now in contemporary politics is the question of slavery and how slavery affects us on an ongoing basis, whether it does affect us, how it affects us, what people who were responsible for making the American political system thought about these things. And I think people who are kind of following contemporary disputes about these matters and approach my book without knowing much about the period I'm discussing will be surprised to see what the position of these Virginia Republicans was. In general, they were actively anti-slavery. In fact, the book starts with, I don't want to give too much away, but it starts with events that are going on around Richmond, where James Monroe is the governor of Virginia at the time, just as Jefferson is being elected president. And what happened in Richmond, just as Jefferson was being elected president, was what we think was the biggest slave conspiracy in American history. Its goal was to kidnap Governor Monroe and then use him as a bargaining chip to get white Virginians to agree to end slavery. And you might think, well, that's pretty amazing. But what's even more interesting is the correspondence between the governor and his political leader, the vice president, Jefferson, who's in the process of being elected president. The two of them agree that slavery has to go. In fact, we think this correspondence is the first surviving evidence of Monroe hoping that slavery would cease to exist in Virginia. And Jefferson says, well, according to the laws of Virginia, we have to treat these people as criminals, but really anybody else would think they were heroes. So we should find a place to which they could be sent where they'd be considered as heroes. Maybe that could mean, and they scout out various different ideas, in the Caribbean, on the west coast of Africa. We're going to correspond with leaders in the British government about sending them to Sierra Leone. By the time we get to the end of the book, Monroe, as president, is sponsoring the founding of the West African country of Liberia, which is a kind of Latin word meaning more or less free place. And it's going to be a place to which the American Colonization Society, of which Madison was for years president, is going to try to send freed slaves from America. So there are other anti-slavery acts that these men take in the book, too. And some of them are very significant. And I think often people who talk about the founding of the United States or the history of slavery or race relations seem totally oblivious to what was really happening. All three of these leaders and many of their followers in Congress don't like slavery. They don't like it. They wish it didn't exist. They hope to do something, and they do significant things about it. I'll give you one more example. The Constitution says that the Congress cannot make any law about the importation of such persons as the states may see fit to import until 1808. So in his annual message, what we now call a State of the Union message, but in those days it was a written note, in his annual message to Congress in 1806, President Jefferson said, the Constitution says, you cannot ban imports of slaves until 1808. So how about if you pass a bill to do that now, and I'll sign it, and it can go into effect as soon as the Constitution allows. So in 1807, Congress passed And President Jefferson signed a bill banning slave imports, which became illegal at the stroke of midnight at the beginning of January 1st, 1808. And this meant tens of thousands fewer people being imported into slavery than otherwise would have been imported into slavery in the United States. So there's several things like this in the book, and you can see that it's a kind of calumny that people are throwing at these people that, well, they talk the talk, but they didn't walk the walk. It's just false.
Well, we will direct our readers then to go buy the book and go read it. It is The Jeffersonians, the Visionary Presidencies of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. Dr. Gutzman, thanks so much for joining us. If people want to see more of your work, where should they look?
They should look at my website, which is kevingutzman.com. That's KevinGutzman.com.
Well, thanks again, and thank you to listening to Conservative Conversations with ISI. If you've enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to head over to isi.org/resources to see all that we offer our members, including the Intercollegiate Review, select Modern Age articles, ISI books, and of course this podcast. Thanks again for listening. Don't forget to rate and review, and we will see you next time on Conservative Conversations with ISI.